There's a specific piece of ground northeast of Los Angeles that most people driving through it have never heard of, and that most seismologists would tell you, quietly, is the single most important 20 miles of geology in the entire state. It's called Cajon Pass, a mountain gap where two of California's most dangerous faults, the San Andreas and the San Jacinto, pass close enough to each other that scientists have spent decades wondering the same unsettling question. If a major earthquake breaks loose on one of them, does it stay contained or does it jump the gap and rupture both faults at once? In June 2026, a team of researchers led by a physicist at the University of Bern finally answered that question with the most detailed, physics-based model ever built of this exact junction, reconstructing 1,000 years of earthquake history along both fault systems to calculate, in precise measurable units, exactly how much stress is sitting in the ground beneath Southern California right now. Their answer is the kind of finding that doesn't need dramatic language to be alarming on its own. The stress levels at this junction have reached the highest point in the entire 1,000-year record the model covers, and the two faults meeting at Cajon Pass are currently stressed in a way that, historically, according to the model's own reconstruction of the past, has preceded exactly the kind of event scientists fear most. A single earthquake rupturing through both fault systems simultaneously. I am your name, and this is your channel. If you want the real science behind headlines like this one, subscribe now, because we go this deep into stories exactly like this every single week. Let's start with why this one specific mountain pass has occupied so much of California's earthquake science for so long. To understand why Cajon Pass carries this much scientific weight, you first need to understand what it actually is geologically. The San Andreas Fault, the roughly 800-mile boundary where the Pacific and North American plates grind past each other, doesn't behave uniformly along its entire length. It's broken into distinct segments, and one of its neighbors, the San Jacinto Fault, runs on a roughly parallel track through Southern California, absorbing a significant share of the same regional plate motion. Northeast of Los Angeles, these two fault systems come close enough to intersect at a specific structural junction, Cajon Pass. This isn't just a geographic curiosity. It's a genuine mechanical crossroads, a point where an earthquake rupturing along one fault has the physical opportunity to jump across and continue rupturing along the other, rather than stopping where the first fault ends. Whether that jump actually happens during any given earthquake determines the difference between a serious, damaging event confined to one fault and a substantially larger, more catastrophic event involving both. The historical record already contains both outcomes, and that's precisely what makes Cajon Pass such a compelling subject for modeling. The Fort Tejon earthquake of 1857, of a magnitude 7.9 event, and the last major earthquake to strike the wider Los Angeles region, terminated its rupture right at Cajon Pass, never crossing over to involve the San Jacinto Fault at all. But an earlier earthquake, the Wrightwood event of 1812, did the opposite. It ruptured directly through the junction, tearing across both fault systems in a single connected event. Same location, same general fault architecture, two dramatically different outcomes, decades apart. That's the exact ambiguity this new research set out to resolve, using physics rather than historical guesswork alone. Here's where the study's methodology becomes genuinely impressive. Because rather than relying purely on historical pattern matching, the research team built something closer to a physical simulation of the fault system's entire mechanical history. Led by Dr. Liliane Burkhardt at the University of Bern's Physics Institute, working alongside researchers from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the USGS Earthquake Science Center in Pasadena, and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego, the team constructed what's called a physics-based four-dimensional earthquake cycle model, a simulation capable of tracking stress across the fault system in three spatial dimensions, evolving continuously over time. They fed that model a genuine, reconstructed 1,000-year earthquake record for the region, built from radiocarbon dating of disturbed soil layers, tree ring anomalies that record ancient ground disturbances, and historical documentation of surface ruptures. On essentially the same categories of physical evidence paleoseismologists use to reconstruct earthquake history everywhere in the world, compiled here into a single, continuous timeline. What makes this model genuinely different from simply cataloging past earthquakes is what it does with that data afterward. As Burkhardt explained, the model tracks how each individual earthquake in that 1,000-year record changed the stress sitting on neighboring fault segments, how that stress then continued accumulating during the quiet centuries between events, and how the deeper layers of the crust slowly relaxed following each major rupture. By running this entire physical process forward as a continuous simulation, rather than treating each historical earthquake as an isolated data point, the researchers were able to estimate, with a level of precision earlier approaches couldn't achieve, exactly how much mechanical stress has built up in this specific stretch of ground as of right now in 2026. This is where the study moves from methodology into the specific, hard data that's generating so much attention, and it's worth understanding the exact figures rather than just the qualitative conclusion. The model found that present-day stress on the San Jacinto Bernardino fault segment has reached 6 megapascals, a level that exceeds the highest value recorded anywhere in the entire 1,000-year simulation. On the neighboring Mojave south section of the San Andreas fault, the model calculated a stress level of 8 megapascals. Individually, both of these numbers would already be significant. But the study's central, more unsettling finding isn't about either fault in isolation. It's about the relationship between them. According to the researchers, the decisive factor in whether an earthquake stays confined to a single fault or jumps across the Cajon Pass junction to rupture both simultaneously isn't simply how much stress has accumulated on one fault alone. It's how closely aligned the stress levels are between the two neighboring systems. When stress on both faults rises together, in concert, towards similarly elevated levels, the model's historical reconstruction shows those are precisely the conditions that have preceded a large joint rupture crossing both fault systems in the past. When the two faults' stress levels instead drift out of step with each other, ruptures have historically tended to terminate at the junction, the way the 1857 Fort Tejon earthquake did, rather than propagating through it. Right now, according to the model, both the San Jacinto Bernardino segment and the Mojave South segment of the San Andreas are not just individually near record high. Stress levels, they're relatively closely aligned with each other, sitting in a configuration the researchers describe as historically associated with joint ruptures crossing both fault systems together. As Burkhardt put it directly, it's concerning enough that stress levels are reaching historic highs on their own, but the added detail that the relative stress relationship between the two faults is approaching the specific range associated with major simultaneous cross-system ruptures is the part of the finding that carries the greater potential consequence for the region. The study introduces a specific new term to describe what's happening at this junction, and it's worth understanding the concept directly, because it reframes how scientists think about fault intersections generally, not just this one in Southern California. The researchers describe Cajon Pass as an earthquake gate, a structural junction that doesn't simply act as a fixed, permanent barrier or a fixed, permanent connector between two fault systems. Instead, it behaves dynamically, its behavior during any given earthquake determined by the specific stress conditions present in the crust at that moment in time. As Burkhardt explained, the earthquake gate concept captures something genuinely important about how fault junctions actually work. Cajon Pass doesn't simply block or channel earthquakes in some fixed, unchanging way. It responds to stress conditions, and those conditions shift gradually over the course of centuries, meaning the same physical junction can behave like an open gate during one seismic era and a closed gate during another, depending on the specific alignment of stress between the two fault systems at that particular point in the region's long earthquake history. This framework is precisely what allows the model to explain the region's own documented history without contradiction. In 1812, the gate was apparently open, and the Wrightwood earthquake passed straight through it, rupturing both fault systems. In 1857, the gate was apparently closed, and the Fort Tejon earthquake stopped right at the junction. The current model's calculation that both fault segments are now simultaneously near record stress and closely aligned with each other is the specific physical signature the researchers associate with an open gate, a configuration where a rupture beginning on either fault would have a meaningfully elevated likelihood of continuing straight through the junction rather than stopping there. It's worth being direct and specific about why a joint rupture crossing both fault systems represents such a substantially different, more severe scenario than an earthquake confined to just one fault. Because the difference isn't simply a matter of degree. A joint rupture crossing the Cajon Pass junction would involve a considerably longer total fault rupture length than a single fault event. An earthquake magnitude scales directly with rupture length, meaning a combined San Andreas-San Jacinto rupture would almost certainly produce a substantially larger, more energetic earthquake than either fault breaking on its own. Cajon Pass itself is far from empty terrain. It's a critical transportation and infrastructure corridor in its own right, carrying major highways, rail lines, and energy infrastructure directly through the geographic heart of the very junction this study identifies as critically stressed. This directly connects to the broader context surrounding California's overall earthquake outlook heading into 2026. Since the Fort Tejon earthquake in 1857, the last major event to affect the wider Los Angeles region, tectonic stress along these fault segments has continued building, essentially uninterrupted, across a prolonged quiet period that has concerned seismologists for years, specifically because of its potential to be storing up energy toward an eventual large rupture. That broader concern is precisely the worst fear. This new, far more detailed and physics-based Cajon Pass model has now given scientists a considerably clearer, more quantified picture of. In the interest of the same grounded, calibrated approach we try to bring to every story on this channel, it's essential to include something Burkhardt herself was explicit and direct about, because it's the detail most likely to get lost in translation as this story spreads. The study is not a prediction of when an earthquake will occur. Burckhardt stated this directly. The system is critically stressed, and physics-based models like this one provide a clearer picture of the range of scenarios the region should be prepared for, but the model does not, and is not designed to, forecast a specific date, month, or even decade for the next major rupture. Earthquake science, even with a model this sophisticated, still cannot answer the question of exactly when. What it can answer, with considerably more precision than earlier approaches allowed, is the question of how the system is currently configured, and which scenarios that configuration makes more or less likely whenever the next rupture eventually does occur. That distinction matters enormously for how this finding should actually be understood. This isn't a countdown clock. It's a substantially improved diagnostic tool, giving hazard planners, infrastructure engineers, and emergency management agencies a considerably more detailed, physics-grounded picture of what the worst-case scenario for this specific junction actually looks like, and how the current stress conditions compare to the historical configurations that have, in the past, preceded exactly that scenario playing out. It's worth closing on the broader significance of this work because Burckhardt was explicit that the framework behind it extends well past the specific fault system it was built to study. As she put it, the question of when and how the next major earthquake will occur in this region is one of the most pressing problems in applied geoscience, and the framework her team developed isn't just applicable to California. It's designed to be usable for other complex fault junctions worldwide, anywhere multiple major faults intersect closely enough that a rupture beginning on one could plausibly jump to another. That includes similarly complex junctions studied elsewhere along active plate boundaries in places like Japan, New Zealand, and Turkey, regions that share the same basic structural challenge Cajon Pass represents. Understanding not just how dangerous each individual fault is on its own, but how dangerous the specific dynamic relationship between neighboring faults becomes when their stress levels happen to align. To support ongoing practical use of this research, Burckhardt has also developed an interactive public tool called LA Grid, the Los Angeles Geospatial Risk and Infrastructure Dashboard, a web-based platform that visualizes seismicity and fault data for the Los Angeles region with live updates on both earthquakes and wildfires, giving the public and hazard planners alike an ongoing, accessible window into exactly the kind of data underlying this study. It's worth pausing to unpack what a term like 3-6 megapascals actually means, because the specific unit of measurement the study uses, Coulomb stress, represents a genuinely important concept in earthquake physics that's easy to gloss over when it's just presented as an alarming number. Coulomb stress is a specific physical quantity seismologists use to describe how close a section of a fault sits to failure. Essentially, a combined measure of the shear force trying to push the two sides of a fault past each other, and the normal force clamping those two sides together through friction. When Coulomb stress on a given fault segment increases, it means that segment has moved measurably closer to the physical threshold at which the rock can no longer resist that force and will suddenly slip. This is precisely why earthquakes on one part of a fault system can influence the likelihood of subsequent earthquakes on nearby connected segments. A rupture on one part of a system typically transfers additional Coulomb stress onto the neighboring segments, sometimes pushing them closer to their own breaking point, a documented mechanism known as stress triggering that seismologists have studied extensively following major earthquake sequences worldwide. The genuine methodological achievement of the Bern-led study is that it didn't simply measure Coulomb stress as a single static snapshot. It reconstructed how that stress has evolved continuously across a full 1,000 years, incorporating every documented earthquake in that window and modeling exactly how each one redistributed stress onto its neighboring fault segments before the next centuries of quiet accumulation began again. That's what allows the researchers to say with genuine confidence, rather than rough estimation, that today's calculated stress levels, 6 megapascals on the San Jacinto Bernardino segment specifically, represent the highest point in that entire 1,000-year reconstructed record. A claim that requires the kind of long, continuous, physically grounded simulation this team specifically built in order to be stated with real scientific weight, rather than as a loose approximation. There's a broader shift in earthquake science this study represents that's worth making explicit, because the earthquake gate framework isn't just a useful metaphor for Cajon Pass specifically, it reflects a genuine evolution in how seismologists model fault behavior more generally. For much of the history of earthquake hazard modeling, individual faults were often treated, out of practical necessity, as largely independent structures, each assigned its own separate probability of rupture, based primarily on its own individual slip rate and rupture history. That approach works reasonably well for isolated faults, but it has always struggled to explain junctions like Cajon Pass, where two major, independently active fault systems intersect closely enough to interact. The earthquake gate framework offers a more dynamic alternative, treating the junction itself as a variable, time-dependent feature of the system, one whose behavior during any given rupture depends on the specific relationship between the stress states of both connected faults at that particular moment, rather than being a fixed property of the junction's geometry alone. This shift matters because California is far from the only place with this kind of structural complexity. Similar multi-fault junctions exist throughout the world's major seismic zones, and hazard models that treat each fault in isolation risk systematically underestimating the true worst-case scenario at exactly the locations where multiple faults meet. By demonstrating a working, physics-based method for modeling how stress alignment between two specific fault systems evolves over centuries, and by successfully explaining both the 1812 and 1857 historical outcomes using the same underlying framework, the Byrne-led team has provided a genuinely exportable template, one Burkhardt herself specifically flagged as applicable to other complex fault junctions worldwide, for closing exactly this kind of gap in earthquake hazard science well beyond the borders of Southern California. In the near term, this study's specific stress calculations are expected to feed directly into California's broader earthquake hazard modeling efforts, work carried out in close coordination with agencies, including the USGS and the Southern California Earthquake Center, potentially refining existing statewide models like UCERF, the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, with this more detailed physics-based picture of exactly how the Cajon Pass junction is currently behaving. Continued monitoring of stress accumulation along both the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems will allow researchers to track whether the current, historically significant alignment between the two faults' stress levels persists, intensifies further, or begins to drift back out of sync in the years ahead. On the infrastructure side, given that major highways, rail corridors, and energy infrastructure run directly through Cajon Pass itself, this research adds a considerably more detailed, quantified layer of urgency to ongoing seismic retrofit and emergency planning efforts across the specific transportation and utility networks that would be most immediately affected by a rupture at this exact junction. Work that regional planning agencies across the greater Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and Riverside corridor are expected to incorporate directly into their own hazard assessments going forward. The broader pattern connecting this story to the wider reality of living along California's fault systems is one worth sitting with. For more than a century and a half since the ground last broke loose in a major way near Los Angeles in 1857, this stretch of Southern California has been quietly, continuously accumulating the exact kind of tectonic stress this new model has now measured with unprecedented precision. What changed in June 2026 wasn't the underlying geology. The stress has been building the entire time, exactly as decades of seismologists warned it would. What changed is how clearly scientists can now see it, and how specifically they can now describe the exact configuration of danger sitting at one particular mountain pass. Northeast of Los Angeles, where two of the most significant faults in the United States have, according to 1,000 years of reconstructed history, arrived at precisely the conditions that have preceded the region's worst-case scenario before. There's a fitting way to close this story that connects directly back to how it began. Cajon Pass has always been treated by earthquake scientists as the single most consequential piece of geology in the region, not because of its size or its individual danger, but because of what it decides. Every major rupture along the southern San Andreas or San Jacinto system eventually has to answer the same physical question when it reaches that junction, whether to stop or to continue. And for the first time, researchers have built a model detailed enough to describe in specific, measurable physical terms exactly which way that answer is currently leaning. That's not a prediction. It's something arguably more valuable for the millions of people living in its shadow. The clearest picture science has ever produced of the actual present-day state of the gate. If this kind of deep dive into the real science behind headline-making research is what you come here for, subscribe now, because we cover stories exactly like this every single week. Drop a comment below and tell me if you live anywhere near the Cajon Pass corridor, or if this is the first time you've heard the term earthquake gate. And if you know someone living in Southern California, send this to them, because understanding exactly what this new model found, and just as importantly what it doesn't claim to know, is exactly the kind of clear-eyed information that makes real preparedness possible. Thanks for watching.